I asked him where the rest of the money from the $4 million sale had gone, and he told me he had invested it in a company that was about to take off. He said it would make us all rich in a few years, and that this was the best way to secure the family's future. He spoke with such enthusiasm that he almost sounded like the boy he once was, the one who used to dream big without thinking about consequences. But the difference now was that he had gambled with something he did not own. The plates arrived, but I barely tasted the food. I kept my voice steady, letting him talk, letting him believe I was cornered. I knew Diane Mercer was on her way, and I felt the weight of each minute. Ryder kept speaking about responsibility and progress, and at one point he told me I should be grateful he stepped in before I made some dangerous mistake. I held my hands together under the table to keep them from shaking. It was not anger that made them tremble. It was the kind of heartbreak that takes a man apart, piece by piece. About halfway through the meal, I saw Diane walk in. She carried a slim briefcase and wore the same calm expression she had during our earlier meetings. She walked straight to our table and greeted me with a warm nod before turning to Ryder. He asked who she was, and I told him she was my attorney. The way his face tightened told me he had never expected the old man he thought he outsmarted to have already prepared a defense. Diane opened her folder and placed several documents on the table. She told Ryder that the ranch had been moved into an irrevocable trust before he filed any fraudulent paperwork at the county office. She explained that the forged signature he had used did not match any verified signature of mine from the last 40 years. Ryder tried to interrupt, but Diane kept a calm, steady tone that pressed him back into his seat. She laid out the findings about the buyer who did not exist, the false business entity, and the money transferred into a crypto scheme that disappeared within days. I watched the confidence drain from his face as each detail landed in front of him with a quiet thud. A few minutes later, Samuel entered the restaurant. He moved with a steady purpose and stopped a few steps behind Ryder, as if serving as a silent witness. Ryder saw him and froze, and for a moment, the boy he used to be flickered through his expression. He asked why Samuel was there, but it came out more like a plea than a question. Samuel told him he had to be, because the truth needed more than one voice to stand on. Ryder began to unravel as Diane continued listing the legal consequences of forged documents and fraudulent sales. His breathing grew shallow and his hands shook each time she mentioned another piece of evidence. I watched him crumble, but I did not speak. I let the weight of his choices settle around the table. This was the moment I had prepared for, the moment where a father sees the full shape of betrayal and decides how he will face it. I felt the sadness, the disappointment, and the slow tightening of grief inside me, but I held myself steady. I could not afford to break. Not yet. Not while the truth was still being laid bare for everyone to see. Ryder sat there staring at the papers Diane placed in front of him, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I watched the confidence drain out of him like water slipping through cracked stone. Diane explained each detail with steady patience, starting with the transfers he made into a series of digital wallets that were tied to a cryptocurrency scheme already under federal investigation. She told him the $4 million he thought he could multiply had collapsed into $240,000 in less than a week, and the rest had vanished into accounts no one could trace. Ryder whispered that it had to be a mistake, but even he sounded like a man who no longer believed the words coming out of his own mouth. When Diane showed him the evidence that the buyer he bragged about was nothing more than a fake profile connected to his own computer, Ryder dropped his head into his hands. His whole body shook, and he looked like a man who had finally reached the bottom of a fall he had been denying for years. I sat there, watching him crumble, and even though part of me wanted to reach across the table and steady him, another part knew this collapse had been coming for a long time. Diane continued her explanation, telling him that the trust made the supposed sale invalid and that the bank had already flagged his transactions as suspicious. Ryder muttered that he never meant for things to go this far, but the words came out broken, almost childlike. Samuel moved closer to the table as if he expected Ryder to fall out of his chair. Ryder looked up at him with red eyes and asked why his brother had betrayed him. Samuel answered that he was trying to protect our family, not destroy it, and that he had no choice once he heard Ryder talking about forged signatures. I am Harlan Hall, and I turned 68 this past spring. Though most days I still feel like the young man who first walked onto this patch of desert with nothing but a borrowed truck and a stubborn belief that I could turn dry land into something worth leaving behind. I built Hall Ridge Ranch board by board, section by section, year after year, until the place felt like an extension of my own breath. On the evening everything changed, the sun was dropping behind the hills, turning the sky into a long streak of burnt orange that made the fences glow like lines drawn by fire. I stood near the porch, thinking about how many sunsets I had watched from that same spot when my oldest son, Ryder, stepped out of his car with a look that did not belong to the boy I once knew. He walked toward me, carrying an envelope, and there was a confidence to his stride that made something inside me tense. I asked him if something was wrong, but he said that everything was taken care of. He pressed the envelope into my hand like he was handing out instructions, not kindness. I opened it and pulled out a check for $15,000. He told me it was enough to live in town, maybe get a small apartment, maybe keep me comfortable. I stared at that number for a long moment, unable to speak, as a strange ringing filled my head. My $4 million ranch, the land I built with 40 years of sweat, was gone because he had sold it without telling me. In that moment, the real pain was not the money. It was hearing my own son talk to me like I was a burden he was ready to move off his shoulders. A week before that sunset, my younger son, Samuel, had shown up at the ranch with worry written all over his face. He told me he had overheard Ryder talking to someone on the phone about documents and signatures, and it sounded like Ryder planned to file papers without me knowing. Samuel said Ryder sounded sure I was too old to keep up and that it was time for him to take control. I remember sitting down in the kitchen after Samuel left and pressing my hand against the table because the room felt like it tilted. I never imagined either of my sons would talk about me like I was fading. Samuel's voice had cracked when he asked if I trusted him enough to listen. I told him I did. And the truth is, that boy has always carried a softness that comes from understanding people better than they understand themselves. If he said something was wrong, then something was wrong. Over the next day, I walked the ranch and looked at every fence post, every gate hinge, every row of pecan trees, trying to decide what to do. I knew Ryder had grown distant over the years, but I never thought he would go this far. Pride can make a man blind, and I had been blind to how far he had drifted from the values I raised him with. When I finally called attorney Diane Mercer, I did it because I knew this was bigger than a family disagreement. Diane listened without interrupting, and then she told me straight that what Samuel had described sounded like elder financial exploitation. Hearing those words made my chest tighten, but it also pushed something inside me into motion. Diane helped me transfer the ranch into an irrevocable trust with my name as the lifetime controller. She said it would shield the land from any unauthorized sale. She also suggested installing hidden cameras around the house in case Ryder tried anything before the paperwork fully settled. I agreed, even though it made my heart heavy to imagine needing evidence against my own son. Still, I knew I had to protect myself and the ranch. As I sat with Diane going over the documents, I felt a sadness I cannot quite describe. But under it, there was a steady determination. I may be 68, but I am not done, and I refuse to let my own child erase me from the land I gave my life to build. Ryder called on a warm evening and told me he wanted to take me out for a special dinner in the city. I could hear the false sweetness in his voice, and I knew he believed the deal was already settled. When we walked into the restaurant, the place was filled with soft lights and quiet music that made every table feel like a stage set up for secrets. Ryder chose a booth near the window and ordered an expensive bottle of wine, as if he were celebrating a personal victory. I watched him move with a kind of polished confidence that felt foreign to me, almost like he was playing a part he had practiced for years. He leaned back in his chair and started explaining why he had made the decision to sell the ranch. He told me it was time for me to stop working, that it was dangerous for a man my age to be out on the land alone, and that he had found a small apartment in town where I could live quietly. He talked about furniture, security elevators, and walking distance to a clinic. I sat there listening, trying to understand how he could look at me and see someone who needed to be packed away. Every time he spoke about my future, his voice was calm, but there was a thin layer of impatience under it, as if he couldn't believe he had to explain such simple things to me. Ryder turned toward me then, and the look in his eyes was one I had not seen since he was a boy, afraid to admit he had broken something. He said he only wanted to prove he could handle the ranch, that he could be someone worthy of carrying the Hall name, and that he had spent years feeling like he was never enough. His voice cracked when he said he had given up music because he believed I needed a son who could run a business, not a dreamer with a guitar. Hearing that hit me in the chest harder than anything Diane had revealed. I remembered Ryder as a teenager, sitting on the fence at sunset, picking out tunes he wrote himself. I never asked him to give that up, but I also knew now that silence can shape a life as much as words. He believed I wanted a son with numbers in his hands instead of melodies, and that belief had driven him into this spiral of reckless decisions. He kept repeating that he just wanted me to see him, really see him, and each repetition chipped away at my anger and left something heavier behind. Diane let him speak, then quietly reminded him that intention does not erase the damage he caused. I took a long moment before I said anything. I could feel the weight of every eye on me, waiting to hear whether I would choose punishment or mercy. My voice felt tight when I told Ryder that this was not about revenge. It was about accountability and the chance to rebuild a life he almost destroyed. I told him he would return every dollar that remained, even if $240,000 was all that was left of the fortune he tried to manage. He would sell his house, his car, and anything of value to add to the restitution, and all the funds would be placed in an account supervised by Diane. I told him he would come back to the ranch and work for 1 year without pay, waking before dawn and learning every task from planting to repairs. The ranch would be his classroom and his consequence, and he would live in the small bunkhouse where the seasonal hands stayed. His financial life would be under full supervision, with no loans, no investments, and no accounts he could open without approval. Ryder nodded through his tears, accepting each condition without argument, and it struck me how different he looked from the man who handed me that $15,000 check days earlier. Samuel asked if Ryder understood the seriousness of what he was agreeing to, And Ryder said he did. Because he had lost more than money. He had lost my trust, and that was the one thing he could no longer bear to live without. I told him trust would not return quickly, and it might never return fully, but this was the only path forward if he wanted any hope of rebuilding our family. His shoulders shook, but he kept his eyes on mine, and for the first time in a long time, I saw sincerity instead of excuses. I finished by telling him that he had one chance and no more. If he broke a single term, the law would handle the rest, and I would step aside. As I said those words, I felt a mixture of sorrow and resolve settle into my chest. It was the hardest choice I had made as a father, but it was the only one that carried both justice and a sliver of grace. Ryder whispered that he would not fail this time, and as I watched him sit there, stripped of all defenses, I hoped he meant it. Ryder's first morning on probation began before sunrise, and I remember hearing his boots hit the dirt outside the bunkhouse. It was around 4:30 a.m., and the sky was still dark, except for a thin gray line over the ridge. He showed up at the barn, ready to work, slow but determined, and I could see that the weight of his choices followed him with every step. In the first few weeks, his hands blistered and his back stiffened from lifting feed and repairing fences, yet he never complained. The ranch hands noticed, and after a while, they stopped treating him like the boss's son and started treating him like a man trying to earn back a life he nearly threw away. The months settled into a rhythm. Ryder learned the soil, the irrigation lines, and how to calm a restless animal. At the end of a long day, he listened more than he spoke and accepted instruction with a humility I'd never seen him in. Watching him work sometimes stirred something old inside me, a quiet pride mixed with caution. Trust had been broken, and it needed more than sweat to mend it. Still, each morning when he showed up before the sun, it felt like a small stone lifted from my chest. One night, late in summer, I found him sitting outside the bunkhouse, under the porch light. The fields were silent, except for crickets in the distance. I sat beside him and he told me he never hated me, but hated himself for feeling like he never measured up. He said he chased money because he thought success would make him worth something. Hearing that softened something in me that anger had kept hard for months. I told him a man's worth comes from how he stands up after falling. He nodded, and for a moment the air between us felt cleared of old shadows. As the year ended, Diane Mercer came to the ranch with her final report. She said Ryder had recovered $620,000 through restitution, acid sales, and cooperation with investigators. She told him he had met every condition of the agreement, and the courts viewed his progress as genuine. Ryder listened with his hands folded, steady but humble, and I felt a quiet shift inside me. It did not erase the past, but it opened a door I thought might stay shut. After Diane left, I asked Ryder to walk with me to the east field. Dawn was just beginning, sending soft gold across the fences and the trees. I told him I was offering him a paid position as assistant ranch manager with a 3-year supervision period. He swallowed hard and asked if I believed he could handle it. I said belief takes time, but effort deserves a chance. The sun climbed higher, warming the land we both loved. It was not forgiveness yet, but it was a beginning, a place where hope could take root again. Boundaries stood firm, and the wounds were still healing.